Where are we?
This is Mark McNeese in New York City, and you're listening to another edition of Live Mic with Mark. Welcome to the podcast. This is Mark, and I've got another great guest lined up this week. It is Serena Worthington, who's already on the line. Serena, how are you?
Great, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, you're the second guest I've had on that I met in Washington at the White House National LGBT Elder Housing Summit. Dr. Imani Woody was on last week, and you this week. And just so people know, you're the Director of National Field Initiatives, Services, and Advocacy. Well, oh no, what am I saying? You're the Director of National Field Initiatives for SAGE. I started to get the long version of SAGE in there. But and I have a question. SAGE was the event sponsor for that, I think, for the summit.
For the White House Conference on Aging, there were two, SAGE and the National. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to remember now.
That's okay.
National Center for Lesbian Rights.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Well, it was a great summit, and I also thought Jennifer Ho gave an amazing keynote.
Oh, she was great, wasn't she?
That was fabulous. But I'm glad to have you on, and I wanted to talk to you about what you do at SAGE. You're in Chicago. I always think of New York, where I am, when I think of SAGE, because their headquarters is here. But I wanted to ask you about that. You're in Chicago. Is SAGE growing, and what sort of growth have they had there, and your part in it?
That's a great question. SAGE is growing a lot right now, especially in the New York region. We just got a grant from the city to add to our senior center. We have the nation's first full-time LGBT senior center in downtown, right there in Midtown Manhattan. And we've recently expanded into all of the boroughs of Manhattan. So that meant a big spurt of growth, but all those centers are open, programming is in place, and it's really rolling. It's just outstanding. But the other thing I would add is that in the 4.5 years I've been at SAGE, we've grown from, I think it was 48 to more than 80 staff. Our budget has grown and our reach has grown. As a nearly 37-year-old organization, I think SAGE is nearly always in a period of growth, but I think we're growing especially fast right now.
What's the what size are you in Chicago? How many of you are there?
There's one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the remote workers are in Miami, LA, Chicago, and DC. So there's one person in each of those locations. And I want to mention something. We make an effort in those spots to house the staff in mainstream aging agencies rather than in LGBT spaces, really to encourage conversation and collaboration. So I'm housed in an organization called CJE Senior Life. It's formerly the Council for Jewish Elderly, and they've long been a leader in LGBT inclusion. And then my counterpart in DC is housed at the Center and Caucus for Black Aged.
Oh, cool. Can you talk a little bit about housing, since we met at the Housing Summit, and just the urgency almost of that situation for our older and elderly?
Absolutely. So I would say the big picture is that if you get a group of older adults in a room, they're going to talk about some very similar things, no matter where they live. And one of them will often be housing and affordable housing in particular. And if you're talking to LGBT older adults, particularly transgender older adults, the issue of safety and inclusion comes up. How welcoming is that space going to be? How safe is the person going to be? And is it going to be located somewhere where you want to be. Here in Chicago, the Center on Halsted and Heartland Alliance is and Heartland Alliance partnered to build Town Hall on Halsted, which is, I think, the fourth affordable LGBT inclusive project in the country. And it's located in Boys Town, also known as Lakeview, which has been historically a gay neighborhood. And I remember years ago when I worked at Center on Halsted talking to some folks for a focus group. And this one man, he really stood out to me. He said, I've lived in this neighborhood my entire life. And now that I'm on a fixed income, I can't stay. I can't afford to live here anymore. And he wanted to be in that neighborhood. He wanted to be around that vitality, and he wanted to be in the midst of his community. And, I think that sentiment is echoed for people across the country.
I know Boys Town fairly well. I mentioned in our correspondence that I grew up in Indiana, Elkhart, South Bend, which is just across the lake. I don't know if that's where Notre Dame is. I don't know if you've ever had any reason to go there.
I have not been to South Bend,
but I have been to Chicago quite a few times. It's one of my favorite cities, and affordability has always been a priority in my mind, because it's great to have housing. You might find something fabulous in Palm Springs, and there's nothing wrong with that. But making sure that our housing is affordable for people, I think, is vital. And I was curious too, and I don't know if you can speak to this, but going beyond the urban centers, I know that Sage has just recently launched a housing initiative.
Yes, yeah.
I'd like to hear a little bit about that, and then I also want to ask you if you have people reach out to you who aren't in Chicago or New York or Philly, and what sort of resources they have.
Sometimes I'm lucky and I can refer somebody to one of our affiliates. We have 27 affiliates in 20 states. We also have community partners and collaborators across the country. However, I do hear from people sometimes about housing, but sometimes about other issues. Maybe they're just trying to connect with somebody, and they might live in a rural area, really nowhere. And those are the calls and emails that are the hardest to respond to, because sometimes there isn't a direct agent. There's not an agency that I can directly refer them to. And then in terms of housing, obviously you need some density to be able to do these projects like the one that exists here in Chicago and in St. Louis. In the Twin Cities, in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia. So you do need that density, because they're expensive projects. They cost 20, 25 million, 27 million bucks. They involve subsidies and partners that are capable of developing a project on that scale. But I think going back to the housing initiative that you were talking about, it's actually a 5-part housing initiative, and one of the components is built housing, because you have to recognize that you can't build enough housing to meet the need for seniors in general and LGBT seniors in particular. And, when I talk about housing, LGBT older adult housing, I am, of course, referring to housing that is inclusive of everyone, that is especially marketed to LGBT older adults, but doesn't exclude anybody. But in addition to that, the other parts of that housing initiative include building services and supports. So if you look at the larger aging infrastructure, you want that to be welcoming to everybody. It also includes moving policy where possible to make sure that LGBT older adults are protected, and that policies are inclusive of LGBT older adults. Training providers is a hugely important piece. So if you can't build housing that meets everyone's needs, then the logical next step is to train the providers that are already running these facilities all across the country. So if you go back to that question you had earlier about if you have somebody who lives in a place that's not in an urban center, that person does live near some sort of residential care,
Right.
whether it be long-term care, assisted living, independent living. So SAGE, through our National Resource Center on LGBT Aging, which is funded through the U.S. Administration on Aging, we have trained more than 6,000 providers in every state in the country, including Alaska and Hawaii. So that means that, in way more cases than there were before we started, the person is likely to encounter a trained provider.
And have you found that these the providers, well, I mean, in terms of the reception, or do they seek out this knowledge and education, or have they been receptive? I was on a webinar a couple years ago with a woman talking to hospice providers, and it was really encouraging because they wanted to know, how do I really handle these situations appropriately with these clients and these patients.
I'm not part of that training team that is through the National Resource Center, but I can tell you that what I hear from them and what my own experience was when I was doing more training myself is that there is a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of interest on the part of providers to be more inclusive of diverse populations in general, and including the LGBT population. There was an interesting study that was done in Minnesota, and it asked providers a couple of things. It was really just trying to see if senior centers in particular were welcoming to LGBT older adults. And one of the most fascinating things that came out of it is that senior centers that had been trained on LGBT cultural competency also received more calls from LGBT people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, is that really, if you think about it, does that mean that it just changes the way that you're receiving a phone call, or when somebody's walking in the door, you just have this different lens? So you're more likely to hear from them that they are LGBT? I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm. It is, the dynamics of that.
Yeah. And I'll mention before we move on, the last part of that 5-part housing initiative is educating consumers. So consumers do need to know what are their rights. They also need to know what recourse they have if somebody is discriminating against them. And they also need to know how to shop for the best facility. What are the standards that you should be looking for?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you just a couple more things. One is about the Center on Halsted, where you were before as the Senior Director of Public Programs. What did you do there? And then the second, it's kind of a follow-up, is how did that lead into what you're doing now, and why? Because you've got your master's in art therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you end up doing what you're doing?
Well, if I may go back 2 jobs, can I do that, Mark?
Yeah.
Okay, so going back 2 jobs, I worked at a really outstanding residential care facility that had assisted living and long-term care, and I ran their life enrichment program. So I was hired to reinvigorate a program that was pretty familiar to people, like a lot of bingo and the kind of activities that you would normally associate with a long-term care setting. And I was hired to invigorate it with a huge sense of culture. So part of what I did there was establish arts-based interventions and art education and arts programming. It was super, super fun. Like, when I started, there was literally one staff person who knew how to draw, who was teaching one resident to draw. And then there was a robust craft program that included ceramics. And what they have today is, I think, at least 3 exhibits a year. Art is their primary intervention on their memory support floors, and nearly everyone's engaged in making art. So it's just a tremendous opportunity and a really fun experience. But what I saw there over my nearly 5 years was that the people that I knew to be lesbian and gay, I didn't have anyone that I knew to be bisexual or transgender, but the people I knew to be lesbian and gay were having a different experience than their counterparts. They were, in a way that was obvious to me, more isolated, less talkative. They spent more time in their rooms. And there was a particular gentleman who people thought he was more needy than I really found him to be. He was a delightful gentleman, and after really delving into trying to find out why people perceived him that way, this social worker finally told me, it's because people think he's gay. And it was like this light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, if you believe the statistics, there's a percentage of LGBT people in this facility right now. 10%, 3 to 8%, whatever that percent is. And in the facility down the street, and the other one down the street. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's got to be LGBT people in all these facilities across the country. And I thought, there's got to be somebody working on this. So I literally started Googling, and I found, coincidentally, that the American Society on Aging, which is a decades old organization, has long had an affinity group for LGBT aging issues. And the conference was coming up. It was going to be in Chicago. It was the last day to register at the reduced rate. And I just registered, and I was like, okay, let's see what's going on. And I went to every single thing that had to do with LGBT aging. And I'll tell you, Mark, that the people I met those days on this chilly March in Chicago are people that I work with all the time now, that I vividly remember meeting outside a workshop. But I also went to a session by a woman who was from the Center on Halstead, and she was there to talk about her program. And I literally threw myself at her. You know how you corner somebody after a really great workshop? And I was like, your program sounds amazing. I'm really interested in your work. I have some pretty significant program development experience. I would love to volunteer to help you out. And she said, well, actually, we're in a search for somebody to run this program. And luckily, I got that job.
Wow.
And it was at a really great time to be at Center on Halstead. I started in May, and they opened to the public in their new, really, really beautiful building in June. So what had been a program that was nurtured along, but had been kept very small, really, because of space limitations and staff limitations, was really allowed to thrive for the first time because they had dedicated staff and dedicated program space and this just huge amount of attention on the center because it was so big and so new and so beautiful. But I really credit that small group of people. It was like 10, 20 people who advocated throughout the design and building of the center for there to be a program for LGBT older adults. And without their voices, I don't know how much longer it would have taken for there to be that program. But it was through their advocacy that the program, I think many other things fell together. Space fell together, funding for a position fell together, and it all just kind of came together in a great way. But their desire to have something there for them really drove the fact that there was something there for them. And it grew really quickly.
And then it transitioned to what you're doing.
I eventually moved out of that position and became the senior director of public programs, which encompassed the entire portfolio of all their community programs. But I really kept my love of working with older adults and my passion for the advocacy piece of this work. And when a position opened up at Sage, I jumped on it. And I've been here ever since.
Well, I'm glad you did, because that's how we met.
That's exactly correct. Yes.
Now, before we sign off, for people, it's easy to assume that everybody knows what Sage is.
Yeah.
Everybody's heard of Sage, which may be true, but there are one of the things that I have liked about doing the LGBT senior website for 4 years is that once in a while I'll get an email from somebody who's not in New York City and not Philadelphia. Maybe they're somewhere in Louisiana, and they'll say, this lets me be in touch with somebody. And so how can people, with the URL for Sage, and just how can people find out more about Sage, wherever it is, in New York and Chicago, and get to some resources?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to plug the organization. So, SAGE can be found at www.sageusa.org. You can also find the National Resource Center at lgbtagingcenter.org. And I want to say one other thing is that we are partners of the Diverse Elders Coalition. It's a group of 5 organizations that represent diverse communities, and that is found at diverseelders.org. And I would encourage folks to sign up for our updates on all those sites. We don't send things out too frequently, but they're always really, really germane. There'll be something that's related to policy, a story about a constituent, a story about a new initiative, a story about what we're doing, with the National Resource Center or the Diverse Elders Coalition. And I would also say, a little bit like what you were referencing, Mark, we have a blog. And so if you're looking for those stories, I would look there. And then one project I oversee is called Sage Story, and it's a digital story collecting project that trains LGBT older adults to be powerful storytellers. So if you go to our website and you look at that, and click on Sage Story, you'll find a robust amount of stories on every topic you can imagine.
I'm going to check that out because that's really right up my alley.
We just published some new ones today, or yesterday. We're in the 4th week of a 4-week campaign to promote the new stories that are just coming out of our excellent partners. Big shout out to North Carolina and Pennsylvania in those states.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah.
And it was great to meet you and all those fabulous people in DC. And I wish everybody had Skype because this is going to sound really good. The sound quality is going to be really good. Most people today either don't have a landline or don't use it. So often my guests will be on cell phones, which is fine. I'm here to accommodate them. But the sound you'll hear it when you hear it. It'll be much, much more pristine.
Well, and it was a pleasure being able to see you, although the audience won't be able to see us, but it was a pleasure to be able to see you while we were talking. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I will, this will post tomorrow and I will send you the link.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye.